Hey everyone, welcome and thanks for tuning into LCC Remix Roundtable Edition. This is a discussion where our pastors unpack the current message in a deeper way. We hope this episode encourages and speaks to you.
Welcome back to another episode of LCC Remix. So good to have you listening today as we continue our current series, The Road to Redemption. And last week we had Pastor Aaron up speaking on covenants, amongst other things.
Yes.
He came out on stage and he had a map. He didn't know his way around stage.
He had a map of water, which is really interesting.
He had a chart.
A chart, that's right.
Yeah, he had a chart.
Call it a map in front of Seth. He will write you. It's a chart.
But, so Pastor Aaron.
Yeah.
We are ready for you to pontificate.
Oh, yeah. I do that really well.
Coffee.
Actually, this was last week. We were sitting in the podcast that I told Pastor Greg on Sunday. I finally got the vision of how these were connecting together. All right, week to week. You had the fall, and then the promise of a Savior, and then it was like, how are we going to get from here to there, and started just kind of studying through the covenants, which I said on Sunday, and I encourage everybody to kind of take some time to kind of see how those covenants lay out, and the ones that are, I've just lost the word, sorry.
All right.
Conditional. The ones that are conditional and the ones that are unconditional. And so just seeing how God's plan of redemption kind of walks through those covenants and down through the generations, and specifically focusing on Abraham. And I was really trying to find, maybe you guys have I was really trying to find a better history of Abraham, because we don't get much of a history before this Genesis 12. We get that he was born and he was the son after the Tower of Babel, and then that's it. Does anybody have any more information?
Steve.
Well, I was looking at you. Greg. You may have gone to school with them. Just kidding.
Well, yeah.
Back in Elementary.
It was a nice, quaint town.
No, I mean the area that he came from. I mean, we don't know a lot specifically. I don't think from the historical record outside of the Bible when it comes to Abraham, but we know a lot about that region. Which even in secular circles is considered the cradle of civilization, and we know a lot about the origin of religion and paganism that came out of that ancient region. So he was living in a land that was pluralistic in terms of its worship of many gods, pagan, and it's just like the Lord when Abram is an example of all of us, and you brought that on Sunday, and how when he calls us out from where we are to walk with him to a place he will show us, the promised land, as it were. It's a walk of faith, and he not knowing what to expect other than God had called him. And so he goes to leave, and he has to, and just like we do, we have to leave all of that former life behind. Mm-hmm. And there was a period of time where he kind of lingered nearby from the land of the Ur of the Chaldeans or whatever.
Yeah, it talks about that in Acts. Stephen runs through that in the book of Acts.
Yeah, but yeah, I know you have more you want to add.
Oh no! Well, one thing it's interesting. They found through archaeological digs and stuff. They found this was actually a really nice place to live at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
People actually had indoor fireplaces and that kind of thing. And so he left that from an established, what we would call, established home, to live in a tent the rest of his life, waiting for a promise that took a long time. The promise of an heir, he was 100 years old or so. And So there's, that's why he was a man of faith. He learned. Now that, he got, I don't want to say a rough start, but he did move around a little bit. He waited till his father to pass away before he really, decided to go, full in, I guess, or, do what he was supposed to do. But, he did live by faith. He lived by a promise. Mm-hmm. And coming out of a pagan culture, God spoke to him. And so Abraham is, he really is a pretty amazing individual. Mm-hmm. And was very well received wherever he went. People looked up to him. He was a very wealthy man. God blessed him. All these things, but he simply, because he trusted God, and that's it's interesting. Trust doesn't take much. You don't have to have a special pedigree or special intelligence or special anything to trust. Mm-hmm. And yet it's so simple on paper, but so difficult in practice because we get in the way all the time. And we see Abraham as one of those people. Now they made some mistakes too, mm-hmm. With Hagar and they tried to do it their way to, help God along. And of course that, hasn't ended well, but yeah, simple trust and that covenant, and it's when you go back to the covenant that God actually made with Abraham, Abraham was asleep basically when that, God cut the covenant, mm-hmm. And so it was it was God's covenant with Abraham, and then so that's speaks to it even greater how good God is, and He enters in with us, knowing we're not able to on our own do anything. Mm-hmm. It's our trust in Him that accomplishes all this stuff.
Mm-hmm. To your point, though, Aaron, I can see where you're coming from with this, and I agree that it's like, okay, here's who his father was, here's who his father's father was. Then God spoke to Abraham. Like, really? Like,
yeah.
Because it almost seems like random without any kind of backstory. Mm-hmm. So, but I mean, we have the information that we need. So,
yeah,
you don't always get what you want.
Yeah. Well, and he did have struggle. I mean, you read chapter 15 and God saying, don't be afraid, like fear not, and again, you talk about that simple trust, and in some respect, and Steve, you mentioned it, like when God gets a hold of us, He's calling all of us to go on some level, mm-hmm. And and it may not be going across the world, but it might be, and are we sensitive to the call of God moving us? When you, as you were talking, like from a pluralistic society, which is what we live in, mm-hmm. and kind of a very forward-thinking culture of as far as we have all of the needs, and our needs are met. We have all of these luxuries. Really, yeah, we're comfortable.
Well, when you said God called us to go, I thought He also calls us to let go. Mm-hmm. And that may be the harder part.
Yeah.
We see with Lot and his wife. Lot's wife had it called letting go of what she had, right, coming out of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so the letting go might be more difficult than the going, because we're okay to do I'll do that, sure, but to let go of what I've depended on or trusted in is a more difficult thing, I think, sometimes.
You said letting go. I was thinking of the term leave and cleave, like the idea of with marriage, this idea that there's something that letting go, that leaving behind, and that I absolutely think is the hardest part for most people.
Yeah.
And when we see that in the Israelites, I mean, you mentioned it on, well, you didn't mention it. I think Abigail mentioned it, talking about the Israelites during announcements. But the idea that they had challenges in letting go of Egypt. Like be better to be slaves there than to be out here in the desert to die. And I think sometimes that's the tendency to look back, mm-hmm. and it's a temptation. I think it can be a temptation for some in the Christian walk, especially when hardship comes. And, taking Abram, for example, I mean, he's called out. And, Greg, you mentioned it. I mean, as a society in those days, I mean, where he was coming from was advanced. I mean, it was an advanced society. All the creature comforts into this wandering of a nomadic lifestyle. I mean, and that's really what it was. You're going to wander the rest of your life. So you're called out of comfort. You said it a minute ago, called out of what's familiar into that unknown, where all that stuff has to be stripped away from you. And that's really, I mean, if you look at Abram's and later, Abraham's life, it's that constant challenge that God is laying before him to trust me, to lay it down. I mean, over and over and over again, you will have descendants. It will be not by your own hand or your own thought, not through your servant, your wife's servant, but it's going to be your own offspring. And, I'm going to give you this land, your descendants this land. I mean, over and over again. And then even having the promise, son in Isaac, and then God saying, okay, you have that now, give him to me. And, that's just, to me, I mean, that's one thing after another to bring him to, you say it a lot, Greg, the end of himself. Yeah. And that's where he had to get.
Well, yeah, he even had to give up his identity.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Think about that.
Mm-hmm.
He went from safety and comfort to danger and unknowing travel. He went from, literally God changed his name, changed his identity. In almost a comical way, because Abraham is a father of nations.
Exalted Abraham is father of nations.
Yeah,
nations,
so he, well, where's your kids? I don't have any yet. You're the father of nations? Well, yeah. So he went through that kind of stuff, but the whole thing was about trust, and he was forced to,
And to that point, I mean, because his name originally is Exalted Father, Abram. And then, and Missler brings this out in some of his stuff. When God changed his name, he added one letter to his name. And it was the Hebrew letter He, which means breath or spirit. Spirit is what it symbolizes. So it was the adding of the spirit to his life.
Yeah, him and Sarah.
Right, to both of them, and changes their names and their identity, just like our identity changes when the Spirit indwells us. Yeah. And he goes from being an exalted father, which honestly, even his name before, exalted father, where are your kids that don't have any kids? Same deal. But now with the addition of the Spirit, you will be the father of many, or multitude, or many nations. And like you said, I mean, it didn't happen right away, but it's going to happen. And he doesn't even see, except through the eyes of faith, the fulfillment of all that. He doesn't see that multitude as many as the stars.
Well, he didn't see the owning of the land. He didn't see all that stuff, and that's just, it's amazing just how he really was a man of faith.
Oh yeah.
Trusted God, not perfectly, but he did trust God,
I think Hebrews brings it out and gives us that insight of like, he, especially with Isaac, he had reasoned in his heart. He believed, he had landed on the fact that even if he offered him as a burnt sacrifice, so even if he slayed his son and set him on fire, that God had promised that he would have multitude through his son, that God would raise him from the dead. Like there was no doubt, and that's why none of that had to happen, because God knew, like, he's here now.
Yeah,
he trusts me completely. I mean, that's at least my 2 cents on that.
Yeah.
God help us live like that. But then he's called the Father of the faithful.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess we're supposed to be like that.
Well, it's certainly the
pretty lousy
standard.
Well, but that's part of it too, right? Is that he wasn't perfect. I mean, and he goes to Egypt and he passes his wife off as his sister because he's afraid of the Egyptians and what they'll do.
Well, he was his half-sister.
Right. That's a whole nother conversation, yeah.
Yeah, things are different now.
Same papa, different mamas.
Things are different now. Remember that.
But we can fall into that trap where we feel like, okay, so now that if I'm gonna live out my faith in Christ, I have to be perfect. Like, I can't have moments of questioning. I can't have moments of doubt. I can't have moments of failing, and yet all the way down through, the Old Testament, and you look at even look at the Hall of Faith, and it's full of broken people who had faith enough to believe the promise that they were given. And so I guess it's just, it's crazy because on Sundays we have really so little time to actually kind of flesh out and move through the full story. Like you really have to get to Isaac on the altar before you can really like his faith comes to fruition at that point, Well,
speak of that, just imagine you've waited 100 years for this kid. Yeah. Okay. How emotionally attached to him do you think you are?
Right.
Seriously.
Yeah.
And then God tells you, I need you to go sacrifice him. And I've heard people talk about it, commentators, somebody, that Isaac could have easily been set up as an idol, the fulfillment of the promise. And this is the way God had to keep Abraham from making that mistake. And so that was done at that time, to put things in perspective again, or to bring everybody back down to reality. That Isaac is not the idol. He is not. Yes, he's part of the process, part of this, this covenant. But any person, if you through your offspring, and you have one, you've waited 100 years for him. You could easily shift all your hopes and dreams from God onto Isaac. And so that whole thing, part of that, and also the picture it paints of our Savior is amazing.
Yeah.
But, it had to, kind of had to happen for Abraham to keep everything in perspective. And it paints a wonderful picture, that's, we talk about the law of first mention, and that's the first place love is mentioned. Take your son, your only son, the one that you love, and sacrifice him. And what does that remind you of? The picture it paints is amazing.
Yeah.
And so just but putting all those things in perspective is pretty amazing stuff.
You had brought up first mention too, because didn't you say it was the first mention of
of faith or believe, and righteousness, like to give.
Yeah. So kind of an important story, I guess.
Well,
Well, another thing we didn't really talk about on Sunday is the role of blood in the covenants. And I think you mentioned it the first week in the fact that, so the fall happens and then they, I think you have mentioned the way like they covered themselves, or God covered them with skins, and where did he get the skins? And I think from that point, like there was the first shedding of blood, which then continues, and here you get the story of Isaac and the sacrifice is the better sacrifice is there. Leading into the Mosaic covenant, which is full of blood as far as what they were required to do. And it's hard for us to kind of wrap our minds around, I guess, because we haven't lived, in that kind of an environment where we're constantly.
Yeah. I mean, we're so sanitized in our modern world. I mean, most people other than their own blood, right?
Yeah. My backyard is full of.
Well, I know that, but unless you slaughter animals like we all have, or unless you've been around blood, But I mean, there's the average person probably walking in suburbia today or urban culture has no idea how. Yeah, and meat's just something I get at the grocery store. They don't think about the whole process.
You grow it at the grocery store.
Well, we've come to the point of why would you kill something? Why would you ever kill anything?
It's delicious.
It's murder.
It's murder.
There's some degree to take the blood part out of it for a second.
Yeah.
There's some degree of, I think people don't get the understanding of the thing. What they were sacrificing was like livelihood. On top of that, what they were sacrificing is things that really they needed, but that God asked for. So imagine putting it in today's terms. If you're not a someone who owns a flocks or whatever, then that doesn't make any sense to you. Mm-hmm. But hey, when you do these things, you have to give up. The sacrifice for this sin is a car. Bring us car. You know what I mean? Like there's a big disconnect with sacrifice. Again, sacrifice isn't sacrifice if it doesn't cost you something, right? Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of times you can kind of gloss over that aspect and you just equate sacrifice with a sheep or whatever. And yes, the blood is obviously important. And as we all know, with Jesus, it comes to pass and he covers all that. But I think that there's like a disconnect because they don't get the other aspects that go along with it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm.
Well, so I raise chickens and rabbits and different things or whatever. And the one thing that I have thought about a lot is how much time and effort goes into,
right.
We're everything is convenience for us. You go down to the supermarket, you walk in there 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you walk out with whatever. When you raise and grow these, it takes time and it takes investment and it takes, all these things. So it's not an easy thing. Mm-hmm. And we never think about this, but Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
Okay. They were offering, one offered sacrifice, one offered from his garden. Okay. They were vegetarians until after the flood, but they raised animals for what?
For sacrifice.
For sacrifice.
Part one thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And, but they didn't eat meat though. They, until after the flood.
And that's why Cain's sacrifice wasn't accepted. And so there was a visible. This wasn't a metaphor.
No. Yeah.
And we have examples in the Old Testament where sacrifices are made and they're received by fire from heaven.
Yeah.
And we see that over and over again in the Old Testament. And so,
God doesn't like vegetables, I think is what
but I think it goes back to that reminder because Adam and Eve in the garden, they knew that their covering wasn't adequate enough.
Yeah.
And that God himself, by his hand, had to shed blood and provide covering for them. And so they knew they had to teach that to their children.
Yeah.
We need to be reminded of our own fall because, again, Adam and Eve were the only ones there at the fall. So even their own first-generation kids can't fully comprehend the extent of the fall, which you mentioned is more than just like, oh, we messed up. It's like everything changed. And if you look at some of the rabbinical histories and literature in Judaism, and a lot of it is it in my mind some of it borders like on mysticism or mythology.
It gives you a glimpse, though.
But they'll talk about because I've mentioned like Adam and Eve's bodies radiating the glory of God. But they talk about like literally like Adam's heels are so bright to look up. Like if we had tried to even look at the heels of his foot, you'd be blinded. They'd be like two suns. I mean, that's how they describe it in the literature. That's, again, that may seem a little mystical or mythological, but the point being, something major happened and life was required. And I think that's why, Abel's sacrifice was accepted and Cain's wasn't, because you've been shown this pattern and you're trying to come to God on your own terms.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's the biggest mistake we can make as believers today. Yeah. I did air quotes, but is to say it's idolatry. It's fashioning a God.
We're going to worship the way we want to worship,
and we will worship God the way we see fit. And we think we're pleasing God, and like why? I mean, because God even challenges Cain's heart, right? If you do what's right, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is to know you or to have you. In other words, it's like it wants to master you, own you. There's an out here. If you did what was right, would you not also be accepted? Right? Isn't that what the Lord tells him? And what does that turkey do?
Yeah. He kills his brother.
He does what we all do at some point in our lives, Anyway, sorry.
Yeah.
Going down a rabbit trail there.
And God does like vegetables because when he made each plant according to its kind, he said it was good.
Oh, it's okay, yeah. So he doesn't like to eat them.
But the flip side is anyone who grills can tell you that that sizzling meat is a pleasant aroma to the Lord.
It's funny you mentioned that. C.S. Lewis talked about that. What the temple was like. It smelled like a barbecue.
Yeah.
Because they sacrificed animal and they burnt them on the altar.
Right.
It's like, it smelled like a backyard barbecue, which is interesting. But anyway, as we digress.
Playing cornhole in the Temple Mount. Styrofoam coolers and
Yeah. The new wine.
anyway.
Yes. So
Wow.
so
Recover.
so all of that points to the Messiah and points to Jesus, and like it's fun. It doesn't matter really what story or what perspective we even take, even just from Abraham's story. If we take the different perspectives, it all points to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And even as we talk about the sacrifices, we are called to sacrifice in the same way, as you said, Scott. Like we're not necessarily called to burn, to have barbecues every day,
Sunday afternoon.
Or when we sin, like we sin, time to get the grill out. But we are called to sacrifice what costs, what it should be a cost even for us today.
Yeah.
And like you said, when we come to Him on our terms, it often doesn't really cost a whole lot.
Yeah.
We kind of push against it a little bit on if you're coming to church is your relationship with the Lord, so what it's costing you an hour on one day a week, we talk about, Jesus in the upper room putting before them the new covenant. This is my body and my blood that is shed for you, and this is the new covenant, and the requirement of the new covenant is the same that it was of Abraham, which is trust and surrender and trust.
Yeah.
I don't think we can overuse that word surrender, because it's the perfect way to describe what it looks like to really be a follower of Jesus, and that's to surrender, every day,
surrender to the Lordship.
Yeah.
Following. Yeah.
Yeah, there really wasn't a question in there for anyone to answer, but just that shift, and so many people, still, I don't necessarily understand it, but want to discount the Old Testament as like that was just for then and them and there, and sure, there may be some, as I'm reading through Deuteronomy, there may be some things that we look at and say, okay, that was cultural for that time period, But
I think when you said, the thing about surrender is when you surrender, you are sacrificing your will. Like Isaac surrendered. Because like you say all the time, the hardest part about a living sacrifice, crawling up.
Yeah.
There's no doubt in my mind that if he wanted to be out of that situation, he'd be gone, right? But he surrendered his will to do it.
When your dad's like over 100,
right,
and you're like 30.
So surrendering your will, or your need to be right, or your whatever, that is sacrifice.
Yeah.
Right. When you do it, when you said leave and cleave earlier, I don't know. I was thinking about when Jesus said, whenever he would confront somebody and he'd say, "Go sin no more." Repentance is like kind of a form of leaving the sin and cleaving to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know where I was going with that, but
Yeah,
that's a good point.
Well, we tend to make it a one-way transaction. We tend to make our salvation like, okay, I accepted the gift. Now do whatever you need to do with me. But it's more like, and just leave it there. Like we talked, like so many, we can very easily say, I had this experience where I experienced my need for Christ. I accept that, and I'm done. And now I'm good.
You can't stay there. You're supposed to then go.
Right.
And that going is in the opposite direction you were going before,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we talk about the repentance. Yeah. So I'm repenting of my own sin and my own will and my own control, and turning towards, what you have for me. And, it's not for sure as easy as it sounds. It is as simple as it sounds. We talk about it a lot of time, but it's not as easy.
I use that to describe the way, the Christianity. I say that all the time, that the concepts are very simple. Jesus gave us 2 commandments. He distilled it down to 2 things we need to do. The concept is very simple, but walking that out amongst all y'all is challenging.
Oh, you blame us.
Yeah.
That's kidding.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we're talking about covenants, and we are in covenant with Christ. We're in covenant with God through Christ, and so it is a give and take. We have a responsibility. It may be, it may not look like it looked in the Old Testament, but it's still a covenant. It's still an agreement that I make, and I have a piece. I have a piece in that. Is the new covenant conditional or unconditional?
Explain what you mean.
Well, I mean, you have to believe. You have to put your
Are you a
trust in Christ.
Calvinist or an Arminianist?
I mean, whosoever believes, that's putting that part's on you.
There's something you
the
have
faith,
to do.
The trust.
Yeah.
The trust.
It doesn't just happen to you.
Right.
Yes. But it's because it's interesting because you said explain it, and that's what I was kind of like. They would say that the Abrahamic covenant is unconditional, but the condition was his faith. Like his faith is what led him down that path, And for us, whereas the Mosaic covenant was conditional, where God said, you will be my people and I will be your God, and this is how you will be my God. I will be your God. You will do this, 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 and this.
And if you don't,
yeah, you die in the wilderness. So I don't know.
I'm just thinking.
Awkward silence.
I was thinking of something Aaron had said earlier. We were talking about some people putting their trust in God, and you mentioned it on Sunday. 5 or 6 years of age, and then just like okay, I've checked that spiritual box, and I'm good to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I was even thinking in the context of worship, how we come to the Lord, and worship is ascribing worth or value to something. And so a question that we might need to ask of ourselves, because we really can't ask it for other people, is when we gather together to worship, is it about us or is it about God? Do we worship because it makes us feel better or think better of ourselves? Or, because I sometimes we hear language like that. Like I go to church. I gotta stop doing air quotes. I go to church.
Why? They can see them.
We have a camera above us.
If you're in the body of Christ, we are the church. Okay, so if we, the church is not a place; it's a people. But we use that kind of language. Well, I go to church because I need my fix for the week, like we're some kind of spiritual crack addict.
Mm-hmm.
Like I go because I like the music, I like the word, or I what we call the word, because it makes me feel better. And I'm not saying there aren't benefits to real authentic worship to the Lord. I think they are. I think there's a deep abiding peace and joy that enters our lives. But I do think we need to ask ourselves the question, like and I think it speaks to that relationship. If all we ever did is, well, yeah, I prayed a prayer when I was a kid and I go to church because, that's what I should do, and it helps me feel better about my life, we might need to pause and ask ourselves, like, are we even worshiping the Lord? Is this even a relationship?
Mm-hmm.
Because it just sounds like you talked earlier about we don't understand the cost of things. Greg, you were talking about you go to the supermarket, spend 5 or 10 minutes, grab your groceries and walk out, not understanding what it took to get to that point. I mean, do we not do that oftentimes when we gather as the church on Sunday? We don't pause long enough to think about what it cost the Lord to build his body, and what it cost others through the generations to pass this on to us. I don't know. I think sometimes we just may become a little too light. Maybe.
Take a lot for granted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just a thought. Maybe it's a little depressing.
I mean, it's what the whole last series, that we talked about over and over again. Each of those things, you have to be intentional in it. You can just bob along and make it through. I about did the air quotes too. Make it through.
It's okay.
But with this, I mean, you have to be intentional, or it's not going to happen. You can't just say, "I believe," and full stop. Now we're good.
Yeah, it's. I always find it so interesting. We know that for a fact in every area of our lives, every other area, that you have to be intentional, and that I'm gonna get in shape. What are you doing? Well, I'm going to get in shape.
Right.
Well, what are you doing? Well, I'm going to get in shape. And you would say round is a shape.
Round is shaped, pears is shaped.
I mean, but you're right.
But every area of life, we have to be, and we know that. But for some reason, we think we can coast through things that are spiritual. It just happens to you.
Well, I think people coast in a lot of areas, because part of it is, again, taking things for granted. We all know we're supposed to eat right and exercise, like to your point, right? They just had a speaker yesterday that did a really good job breaking down about just food and how messed up we are in our society. But everyone thinks that they can be the exception.
Yeah.
And it's true in America, I feel like, especially, like, oh, yeah, this is only for, like, fifth graders. Yeah, but my kindergartner is really smart. He can take. We all always think that we, or our loved ones, whatever. We all always think that we're the exception.
Yeah.
When everyone's special, no one is.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
It doesn't work that way. Yeah. Like, the fact is, you know these things that you should do. You should be doing it.
Yeah.
We just don't.
Yeah. That's why it says to be doers of the word and not hearers only. And if you would just spend time in the epistles, and go through all that and actually read what's there and see what it says, which is
I want you to say that.
Which is a good practice.
So what you're saying, Greg, is if I actually spent time reading God's word and putting it into practice, my life would look different.
It sure would.
Kind of like if I cleaned proper every day, I'd smell different.
Have more friends.
I'm not saying I'm gonna. I'd have more friends.
My wife and I, Linda and I, listened to a testimony last night of a young man, and pretty, went through some stuff. And the one thing he said, I won't go through the whole story, but there towards the end, when he finally got to his end, drugs and just addictions and all kinds of stuff, and was facing criminal charges and blah, blah, blah. So he finally surrendered, he literally finally surrendered to the Lord. He'd been in and out of church, all the whole story. And then he said, the part I noticed is he said, he goes, I just had a hunger for the word. He goes, and I just devoured the word. I couldn't get enough of it. I spent 2 or 3 hours a day. And he just watched his life change, and all these things that had bound him started to fall off. And there was and so from that, 2 years later now, he's starting to be a teacher in his church and mentor and all those things, and coming out of this lifestyle that was pretty rough. He was military, and he did all, just all that, Afghanistan, and just seeing all that and all the PTSD stuff and the drugs and the psychotic drugs and the trying to get him back on track and just, all this stuff. Is when he got into the word, he surrendered and started to devour the word, that his life changed. And for some reason, we don't put enough emphasis on the word of God and actually spending time in it and absorbing and that being part of us, and that changes us. That's the bread, the food that we need is the word, to grow spiritually and stuff. And so it's don't be just hearers of the word, be doers, put it into practice.
Right.
Yeah, it's all over.
And it's an incremental thing and a gradual thing over time, just like exercise or eating right, any of those things. Because I think some people like, well, I read the Bible, I spent time in the Word every day this past week, and I don't really feel that different. Okay.
I took vitamins this morning.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I see no change.
Right. I worked out and I look exactly the same. You get what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
It's the people that don't sit in the chair. They stand behind it and smile. No, yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, that's my shirt. No, it's okay. I'd rather stand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bottom line, study the word.
Yeah.
That story made me think.
He pointed at me.
Yeah, sorry. The story about the young man. Talked about the promise of Messiah and like Genesis 3, right? And the promise is the covenant with Abraham, and he's old, and I mean, it makes me think too, like David is anointed king, but he's not. There's a span of time when he's not. And there's all these things that take me to 2 Peter 3. That the Lord is not slack concerning His promise. And a lot of times we have issues with His timing. But that in turn made me think of something Randy had sent me that said the only time in the Bible that it talks about God being quote unquote in a hurry is the father of the prodigal son running to meet him. So that's why the story made me think of it. Like it's never too late. God wants us all. He wants to draw us all to Him. We just need to do it.
Yeah. Draw near to the Lord, He will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you're double-minded. Yeah.
And it's a promise.
Yeah.
A lot of promises.
Yeah.
Where are we heading this week? Who's up this week?
I'm this week, I believe. I've been preparing. I haven't looked at the calendar. I'm pretty sure it's me this Sunday.
You're up this week.
I've been preparing. It's on Passover. Be talking about Passover. So, yeah, I'm actually very excited about it.
Passover is amazing.
It might be a little jarring when I bring the lamb in, but it's going to be okay. I actually thought about getting a lamb from the Amish where I live, and just as I'm not going to do anything to the lamb. I'm not a monster. But I wouldn't do anything at church.
Needed new carpet on the stage anyway.
I need 3 lambs for 3 services. That would be horrifying.
Yeah.
It would drive the point home, though.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
No, we're not gonna.
That's a rich that's a rich study right there, the Passover, and yeah.
All about Christ coming and being the Passover lamb and the shedding of blood. Again, we're back to blood again.
And the new covenant.
And what we call the Lord's Supper, communion. Trying to figure out a way to fit that in. I know we celebrated the Lord's Supper a few weeks ago, but I'm trying to figure out a way to end the service with that.
Yeah.
But
there isn't a law that says you can't.
I know that.
Oh no! We already did this month.
No. I'm not. I guess the way I phrased that was
we're not.
Just trying to. I want to. I don't. It's one of the challenges that we have in having a condensed like an hour service because of the rotation of services is sometimes things feel like we're pushing or rushing. And that's definitely something that we don't want to do when it comes to the Lord's Supper. And we don't want it to ever be viewed as like an add-on or this is something we do out of some sort of obligation. But
gotta squeeze it in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just thinking about what that might look like this week.
Very good.
But, so I'm looking forward to it.
For sure. We're looking forward to talking to you again next week. And we'll be talking about the Passover. We hope you have a good week and draw near to the Lord, and He will draw near to you this week. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks for listening to LCC Remix. If you have any questions about this podcast, reach out via email at lccremix@lifechurchcalvert.com. LCC Remix is a podcast ministry of Life Church Calvert, located in Huntingtown, Maryland. You can visit our website, lifechurchcalvert.com, or download our app by typing in Life Church Calvert in your app store today.